raise a hand at some point if I'm too quiet, but I'll try and enunciate and project. Anyway, hello, I'm George Davis. I'm a recent graduate from the University of Birmingham in English literature, mostly of the 19th century. Most of the research from this presentation was undertaken, as Samina said, as part of a paid internship for Town Hall, ahead of International Women's Day this March, to research the 19th century history of women's suffrage activism in Town Hall and in Birmingham more widely. This is in the spirit of the opening lines of historian Elizabeth Crawford's fantastic book on the Birmingham campaign. The growth of the women's suffrage movement in Birmingham can be traced through its streets and buildings in which the men and women of the city conducted their campaign. I would like to thank the University of Birmingham and Town Hall, whose funded internship made this research project possible. I would also like to acknowledge the contribution of two historians, Dr. Nicola Gould and Elizabeth Crawford, whose books have been invaluable in this research. I will present a bibliography in my closing slides. In this lecture, I aim to give a general account of the Birmingham women's suffrage campaign, how a radical campaign in Birmingham impacted the national campaign, and later in the 20th century, how a radical national campaign impacted Birmingham, and relate all of this to the progress of democratic reform in the same period. So, a sensible place to start a discussion of the campaign for women's suffrage is the 1832 Reform Act. Passed in response to democratic agitation following the French Revolution and the economic hardship of the Napoleonic Wars, the bill expanded the town and county franchises by lowering the threshold of property or income which qualified a man for the vote. It also redrew constituency boundaries to reflect the changing urban industrial population of the 19th century. Before the 1832 Act, Birmingham did not directly elect any MPs, instead being part of the Warwickshire constituency, which elected two. The Isle of Wight, by contrast, elected 6 MPs, 2 of which were elected by just 23 voters. Under the 1832 Reform Act, constituencies were redrawn to reflect population, and Birmingham finally became its own constituency, able to directly elect 2 MPs. It may seem strange to begin with an act which left women still unable to vote, but the feeling of that neglect was the spark for an early act in the campaign for women's suffrage. In the same year, the radical MP Henry Hunt, who a decade earlier had been the epicenter of the Peterloo Massacre in Manchester, presented to Parliament a petition written by Mary Smith of Stanmore, Yorkshire, signed by thousands. Mary Smith's argument, presented 96 years before equal franchise in 1928, is initially stated in terms identical to Thomas Paine and the American revolutionaries of the previous century. To quote from parliamentary records, quote, "The petitioner stated that she paid taxes, and therefore did not see why she should not have a share in the election of a representative. She also stated that women were liable to all punishments of the law, not excluding death, and ought to have a voice in the making of those laws. But so far from this, even upon their trials, both judges and jurors were all of the opposite sex. She could see no good reason for the exclusion of women from social rights, while the highest office of the state, that of the crown, was open to the inheritance of females. The prayer of the petition was that every unmarried female possessing the necessary pecuniary qualification should be entitled to vote for members of Parliament." End quote. The emphasis on pecuniary qualification, or ownership of property, or rental dues, here will later become an issue of contention between and among the suffragists and suffragettes, whether to fight for votes for women along the same oligarchical lines of property qualifications as for men, or to fight for universal suffrage, irrespective of economic means, for all women and men. However, at this stage, Mary Smith's petition is laughed out of Parliament by Earl Grey's Whig government and is not voted on. Yes. Another concerted effort to bring the issue of women's suffrage to a parliamentary vote was the 1866 petition, pursued at that time because the Second Reform Act was then under discussion. The petition was to be organised by a committee of women, including Helen Taylor, and to be presented to Parliament by Taylor's stepfather, the radical MP and utilitarian philosopher John Stuart Mill. According to Gillian Murphy of the LSE Women's Library, between 1866 and electoral equality in 1928, the suffragists would deliver a further 16,000 petitions. The 1868 petition declares, quote, "The possession of property in this country carries with it the right to vote in the election of representatives in Parliament. It is an evident anomaly that some holders of property are allowed to use this right, while others, forming no less a constituent part of the nation and equally qualified by law to hold property, are not able to exercise this privilege. Your petitioners therefore humbly pray your Honourable House to consider the expediency of providing for the representation of all householders, without distinction of sex, who possess such property or rental qualifications as your Honourable House may determine." This petition attracted the signatures of 1,499 women in the space of 1 month, quite an impressive feat for the 19th century. Luckily for us, the signatures were published alongside with their addresses, allowing us to see that 4 of the signatories of the 1866 petition are from Birmingham and the immediately surrounding areas, although none of these names would go on to be major players in the Birmingham campaign, like Eliza Sturge or Caroline Taylor. April 1868 saw the founding of the National Society of Women's Suffrage in London, the precursor to the NUWSS, in response to the failure of the 1866 Act, again to address equalising franchise. Caroline Taylor and her husband William were the founding members of the executive committee of the Birmingham Women's Suffrage Society, the local branch of that national society. Mary Johnson was its first secretary, and she took guidance from Lydia Becker, secretary of the Society's Manchester equivalent. This would not be the first time that suffrage campaigners in Birmingham would feel the influence of those from Manchester. In 1871, Mary moved away on marrying and was replaced as secretary by a fierce campaigner, Eliza Sturge. Students of Birmingham's 19th century radical history might recognise the surname. Eliza is the niece of Joseph Sturge, the abolitionist campaigner who was commemorated with a statue at Fiveways. As is so often sadly the case with the histories of women, while her uncle has a statue, I haven't been able to find a single likeness of Eliza Sturge anywhere on the internet or in the Library of Birmingham's Portraits collection. Hence, we're still on this slide. In December 1871, within Eliza's first few months of becoming secretary of the society, she organised a meeting at the Masonic Hall in Birmingham, which boasted as a speaker a then 23-year-old Millicent Garrett Fawcett, who would go on to lead the NUWSS 30 years later, and who is now commemorated by a statue in Parliament Square, the first statue of a woman there among 11 male statues. An interesting point here from Gould is that this 1871 meeting was presided over by none other than George Dawson, the radical nonconformist preacher whose preaching of the civic gospel and his preaching to a congregation of future radicals had such an impact on Birmingham's municipal identity. Samina, if you can pass this on to Roy, I'm sure he'll find it interesting. And it is interesting to track the confluence of radical liberal issues among Birmingham's nonconformist circles. George Dawson was an early supporter of the Birmingham Women's Suffrage Society, and his wife, Susan Dawson, was a member of the executive committee alongside Eliza Sturge. Elizabeth Dale, wife of Robert Dale, one of George Dawson's close supporters, was also on that committee, as was, finally, in 1872, the Reverend Henry Crosby of the Church of the Messiah and his wife. In 1872, having given speeches as far afield as Bristol and Rochdale near Manchester in her first year as secretary, Eliza Sturge organised and addressed a meeting at Birmingham's Town Hall. Again, Millicent Fawcett came from London to address a Birmingham audience with Eliza Sturge's invitation. The wonderful thing about this meeting is that the speeches of Sturge and Fawcett both exist in print, in part or in full to this day. We know that Fawcett opened her speech proclaiming that, quote, "The history of civilization is the history also of a steady, progressive improvement in the condition of women," end quote. A loaded statement to the stalled progress of the Representation of the People Act 1867, which had failed to expand the voting franchise from 1832, and to a failed bid of 1871 to remove the electoral disabilities of women a bill which had been supported by all three of Birmingham's Liberal MPs. It would be another 50 years from that meeting before women were partially enfranchised in 1918, by which time Millicent Fawcett was over 70 years old and had been president of the NUWSS for 20 years. She would only survive equal franchise in 1928 by 1 year. In that December 1872 meeting, Millicent Fawcett also called into question the philanthropic credentials of Birmingham's great radical men, such as Eliza Sturgis' uncle, who had campaigned for adult manhood suffrage as founder of the perhaps inaccurately titled Complete Suffrage Union. Quote, "I can scarcely imagine that the Birmingham politicians who took so prominent a part in the reform agitation for the extension of the suffrage to working men can be blind to the patent fact that all the most convincing arguments used during the agitation in favour of admitting the working classes to representation apply with equal cogency to the case of women," end quote. This call may have been heard by Joseph Chamberlain, as 4 days later, on the 10th of December 1872, he pledged in a speech to, quote, "complete the work of the 1867 Reform Bill by claiming suffrage for women who were householders," end quote, at a meeting of the Liberal Party in Birmingham. The full text of Elijah Sturgis' speech has been reprinted in full from the Fawcett Library in a book called Before the Vote Was Won, Arguments for and Against Women's Suffrage. Simply entitled Women's Suffrage, the speech is far from a dry discussion of constitutional law, and instead grapples with the reasons for which suffrage is fought, directly addresses social politics and the injustices of patriarchal society. Given the limited time of this lecture, I've had to abridge her speech, but it nonetheless deserves to be orated, so I'll quote from it extensively. Quote, "I have much pleasure in supporting this resolution, as I should have in supporting any resolution that tended to the removal of unnatural restrictions upon life and liberty." Excuse me. Long speech. "But I sometimes find that the words I design for support damage the cause I desire to serve. I know many ladies think this was the case when I set a low value upon the surface forms of politeness which we are supposed to receive in lieu of the vote. I meet plenty of gentlemen carrying ladies' umbrellas. The ladies, as a rule, are perfectly well able to carry them themselves. Therefore, this is only a symbol. I wish I could think these same gentlemen were equally ready to help the little child in the streets with her heavy burden, or the weary woman with her barrow of coals. I am told that I receive certain social attentions and distinction because I am a woman. If I find the seamstress and the kitchen maid are not also receiving them, well, this must be a mistake, for they are equally women. As a liberal, I naturally feel grieved that the Liberal associations seem to care so little for women's suffrage. This is said to be because they think women will be conservatives. But how can the Liberals expect women to be other than conservatives, so long as the Liberals are conservatives to them? Another explanation that has reached me is that women do not subscribe to Liberal associations. This must be a mistake, for if it means anything, it would mean that Liberal associations only give justice to those who can afford to pay for it. I think the gentleman who made that suggestion can hardly be aware of the monetary disadvantages to which women are subjected. If the girl in the family thinks that she has the capacity to excel and be useful in some profession in life, the father will say that he cannot spare the money, the mother that she cannot spare her daughter. But if a husband should appear, he can take a girl and gold to the Antipodes. The father will sing out that he can spare the money, the mother that she can spare the daughter. It would almost seem as if a girl had no right to her own life. Do not mistake me. I am not undervaluing the beauty and holiness of a life of unselfish devotedness to the interests of others. But for an act to be unselfish, it must be perfectly voluntary. So long as services are exacted for women as if they were obligations, they have no power to be unselfish. When will mankind learn that if they will not allow room for the virtues of independence, they must be content with the vices of dependence? If there is an evil under the sun which affects men injuriously, you dig for the cause and drag it out by the roots. But if it affects women only, you are content to despise the fruit and throw stones at the branches. Men say, women don't know, they can't see plainly. Very likely they do not see plainly, because men will stand between them and the light. And this is just as injurious to the men as to the women, for they get dazzled with a sense of their own superiority. And as long as women bow down before this assumed superiority, our women will be dolls and our men will be idols. It is certainly bad to be a doll, but it is worse to be an idol. Worse because it is profane. There can only be two grounds on which men refuse the suffrage to women duly qualified to receive it, whether because women have no souls or because men are infallible. Men will not allow infallibility to the Pope, therefore they cannot consider themselves infallible. It has been said in old times that women had no souls, but I do not think anyone tonight is prepared to reiterate it. You may say we have liberty of conscience. Liberty of conscience without liberty of action is a mockery. I have no desire that women should be a law unto men, any more than men unto women. I simply long that they may both seek after a higher law, and in this unity of purpose there will be harmony." End quote. The flurry of activity in the early 70s was carried out in the face of financial difficulties for the society. Crawford has the historian Crawford has a great turn of phrase here, saying, quote, "The treasurer was not overburdened with work, because throughout the 1870s the Birmingham society was always short of funds." This we can see clearly in a letter penned by Eliza Sturge on the 11th of May 1874, which can be read in the Wolfson Institute. As a side note, I would have liked to include a photograph of this in my slides, as I couldn't present a likeness, and I thought her signature would be the next best thing. Unfortunately, it's still under copyright. But you can see it yourself. Anyhow, I can describe and narrate it. It is written under the letterhead, Birmingham branch of the National Society for Women's Suffrage, and begins, quote, "Dear Madam, I have received from Mrs. Darby a contribution of £3 10s to the funds of the Society. I feel that we at Birmingham have to claim this kind donation, and I should like just to tell you how pleasant it is to have a voluntary gift of this sort. Money. I'm sure those in the audience working in activism or academia will recognise the sentiment." She continues, quote, "It is to you I understand that we are mainly indebted, with money that is. I am yours sincerely, Eliza Sturge." End quote. Eliza Sturge would move away with her family to Bewdley in Worcestershire in 1878, but remained as honorary secretary until at least the mid-80s. In 1881, Birmingham Town Hall was the venue for a grand demonstration in support of Liberal MP Hugh Mason's call to give the vote to women householders. Speakers at the demonstration included Sturge herself and Mrs. Elizabeth Dale, as well as speakers from London and Manchester. Crawford points out that the suffragist strategy at this time was to demonstrate what the government slyly termed evidence of a genuine public desire to see women's suffrage debated in Parliament, and this is reflected in the pricing of the event, as women had free admission and men paid just 2 shillings and 6pence in an attempt to fill the stalls. The event was followed up in January 1883 with another meeting at Town Hall led by Catherine Osler, who expressed her frustration at the lack of progress despite the huge turnout 2 years previously. Catherine Osler is a hugely important figure for the women's suffrage movement in Birmingham. Her mother and father, Caroline and William Taylor, had been the founding members of the Birmingham Women's Suffrage Society, and in 1885 she would go on to replace Eliza Sturge as secretary, a post she would hold until 1903, when she became president until the partial enfranchisement of women in 1918, a total commitment to the society of 33 years. In 1911, she would also join the executive committee of the NUWSS, chaired by Millicent Fawcett, and she would die in Edgbaston in 1924, 4 years before equal franchise was achieved. Later in the 20th century, it was Catherine Osler who would push the Birmingham Women's Suffrage Society in a more radical direction towards the involvement of working class women. As local historian Carl Chin wrote of Catherine Osler for the centenary celebrations of women's suffrage last year, it's really important to remember the role of working class women in the movement. For some it was just a middle class movement, but those women in the factories had to campaign and do their hard day's work. You may have noticed that hitherto calls for the enfranchisement of women have been to remove the electoral disabilities of women, giving women the right to vote on the same terms as men, that is, in an oligarchical qualification of owning a set amount of property rather than fighting for the vote of all women and men. It is worth remembering that the 3 Birmingham MPs who voted for the enfranchisement of propertied women in 1871 had been elected on a turnout of 22,000 in a city of 400,000. This is of course not to say that propertied women were unjust to call to be enfranchised on the same oligarchical terms as men, but that the franchise they were denied was both unjust for excluding women and for requiring property qualification. The BWSS's campaigning in the 1890s was unfocused due to divisions among the middle-class liberals, leading to splinter groups forming from the National Societies of Women's Suffrage, of which the BWSS was a constituent part. In 1897, however, Birmingham was the site for a national conference of women's suffrage societies, the outcome of which was the founding of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, the NUWSS, presided over by Millicent Fawcett, then 50 years old, and having campaigned for women's suffrage for nearly 30 years. The NUWSS remained committed to their law-abiding constitutional approach. In 1901, after almost 20 years as secretary, Catherine Osler became president of the Birmingham Women's Suffrage Society, and over the next few years facilitated the establishment of women's suffrage branches in Coventry, Warwick, Greenwich, and Leamington. She also pioneered for the West Midlands the efforts to involve working women, initially among the chain makers, and nail makers of Cradley in the Black Country. And during the year 1907, 30 women's suffrage meetings were held in Birmingham. Crawford supposes that the increased activity of the Birmingham Women's Suffrage Society was perhaps invigorated by the founding in October 1903 of the Women's Social and Political Union by Emmeline Pankhurst. The WSPU's practicing of militant methods certainly brought the issue of women's suffrage to national attention through the notorious newspaper headlines of vandalism and arrests, and at last, the concentrated ire of the local Birmingham press. It is thus only at the start of the 20th century, with less than 50 years of a centuries-long campaign left before partial enfranchisement, that the 2 main protagonists in the national imagination of the women's suffrage campaign consolidate: the slow, steady, sensible NUWSS and the new, fierce WSPU. Neither of those are strict definitions of the 2 organisations, but I'm sure if you asked John Bull or Britannia their take on the suffrage campaign, that is the impression you receive. It is indicative of the contemporary impact of Emmeline Pankhurst's militant WSPU that despite existing for around a tenth of the time from Mary Smith's 1832 petition to the end of militancy in 1914, that they nonetheless dominate the cultural recollection of that campaign. However, at the start of the 20th century, it becomes harder to talk of a Birmingham women's suffrage campaign, and increasingly we must speak of Birmingham's place in a national campaign. While the Birmingham Women's Suffrage Society continued much in the same way it had for the past 40 or 50 years, though with more popularity, the focus has now shifted from presenting popular petitions to local MPs so that petitions might enter Parliament. Conversely, Pankhurst WSPU runs a very effective but top-down national campaign with the intention of putting pressure on the national government. In contrast to the stories of Eliza Sturge and Catherine Osler, Birmingham women who led the campaign in their city, WSPU organisers were typically appointed centrally by the Pankhursts, and this was especially the case for the important central industrial city that is Birmingham. In 1907, this was Nell Kenny, sketched in a Birmingham newspaper here. Nell was the younger sister to the working-class suffragette Annie Kenny, who, along with Christabel Pankhurst, had been 2 of the first WSPU suffragettes imprisoned a couple of years before. Nell Kenny and the WSPU evidently did not waste time establishing their presence in Birmingham, as on Wednesday the 20th of November 1907, Nell Kenny hosted a meeting at Town Hall, which was pretty much a who's who of the 20th century suffragette movement. Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughter Christabel gave speeches that evening, as did Emmeline Pethick Lawrence, who, with her husband, the socialist politician Frederick Pethick Lawrence, was highly influential in the running of the WSPU. I'm sorry, this projector makes things hard to read. Emmeline and Frederick Pethick Lawrence together edited the WSPU's newspaper, Votes for Women. Thanks to the British Newspaper Archive, you can read every issue in any library which has an online subscription, which is why I can reproduce it here. In the local report section of the November 1907 issue, we can see evidence of Nell Kenny's passionate activism in her first month as organiser, with, quote, a series of drawing room, open air and factory gate meetings, besides addresses to be given in different religious societies, cooperative guilds, etc. And she elsewhere claims that, quote, Birmingham, we believe, is about to become one of the strongholds of our movement, end quote. I made an allusion a moment ago to the local Birmingham press, and this is a topic which Samina will be covering in far more interesting depth in a Monday lecture on the 24th of October, one for your diaries, than what I'm about to sketch out. I'm referring to regional illustrated satirical papers on politics and local gossip, which sold weekly at a generally affordable price, which run between roughly the mid to late 19th century and the early 20th century. The BMI is one of 3 places in the world where one can find a complete collection of the issues of the Birmingham Pictorial and Dart, a conservative publication, and the Birmingham Owl, its liberal counterpart. I should add, you can actually physically touch it here, which you can't in the library. I've honestly had a lot of fun over the summer and on my regional project earlier in the year trying to pinpoint references to the events that I could place in Birmingham in those publications. Despite their differing ideological positions, it seems that both the Owl and the Dart are equally dismissive of women's suffrage. And I assume it is because of the press notoriety that the WSPU's actions in the early 20th century make a breakthrough into the Birmingham satirical press, and not the NUWSS's of the previous 50 years. If one wanted to be uncharitable to the constitutional NUWSS and complementary to the militant WSPU, one could say that this is because the WSPU's methods made them harder to ignore, if one also believes that all press is good press. Either way, the attention of the local press allows us to gauge the experience of an admittedly male and cliquey local reaction to a campaign which had become less local and more national. What we have in the Birmingham Owl Whispers section for the week before that 20th of November meeting is, quote, that next week the suffragettes are making another raid on Birmingham, and, quote, that the town hall is being reserved for their comic display, end quote. And for some reason, later in the same column in the right image, that Mrs. Pankhurst and other ladies will address a public meeting in the town hall on Wednesday with a view of getting votes for women, and, quote, that Miss Christabel Pankhurst will take the chair, end quote. Christabel Pankhurst, of course, being something of a celebrity among that lineup. Nell Kenny's stint as WSPU organiser in Birmingham was relatively short-lived, as she emigrated to Canada with her husband the next year in 1908, where perhaps hopes of female enfranchisement were higher, as since 1900, property women had had the right to vote in municipal council elections. In reality, however, as an interesting side note, although at this stage the Canadians seem to be ahead of Britain, the last Canadian state to give women the right to vote was Quebec in 1940. Gladys Keevil replaced Nell Kenny as WSPU organiser for the Midlands in June 1908, where she worked closely with Bertha Ryland, soon to be perpetrator of a famous act of local suffragette vandalism, and whose name no doubt some of you recognise. A few months after arriving in Birmingham, in October 1908, Gladys Keevil and her co-conspirator, Helena Jones, took part in a daring raid on a meeting at Town Hall. As luck would have it, none other than the Prime Minister, Herbert Henry Asquith, was visiting Birmingham Town Hall to address the Birmingham Classical Society on Friday, the 11th of October. As the Birmingham Pictorials actually went to press on a Friday, I've managed to find a portrait of Asquith in the Owl, who, definitely can't read that, quote, delivers his presidential address to the Classical Association in Birmingham today, brackets, Friday, hot off the press as it were. Going forward to the 15th of October 1908 edition of Votes for Women, in the regional reporting section, Gladys Keevil narrates the action of the previous Friday. On Friday evening, Mr. Asquith was present in Birmingham and addressed the Classical Association at the Town Hall. Although it was a non-political meeting, we determined that Mr. Asquith was to be made to realise that here, as elsewhere, women demand that the Liberal government shall deal justly towards them. The most elaborate precautions have been taken to exclude any possible suffragette. Notwithstanding, we made our presence felt both inside and outside the hall. A party of our workers, energetic and enthusiastic women, sold newspapers and distributed handbills to the large crowd assembled in the vicinity of the hall, which had quickly gathered when it became known that the suffragettes were present. Subsequently, another leading member and myself entered the hall. How, of course, is only another of the wonderful suffragette secrets. Bearing in mind the non-political nature of the proceedings and of Mr. Asco's speech, we waited until the conclusion, and then, to relate what took place in its order of sequence, I advanced rapidly up the hall and informed Mr. Asquith that while I had no intention of interrupting a non-political meeting, now it was over, I felt it necessary to take this opportunity of asking him what the Liberal government intended to do for women's suffrage this session, reminding him that on the last occasion I attempted to see him, I had been in prison for 6 weeks. I also offered a current copy of our Votes for Women paper. I then disappeared from beneath the platform, and Dr. Helena Jones took up the thread of the subject and afterwards left the building. Though Mr. Asquith gave no answer, it was considered apparently that the question was disposed of, but to the utter astonishment of everyone, I reappeared in the orchestra, above the platform this time, and reiterated that question which up till now cabinet members had only replied to evasively and in a totally unsatisfactory manner. Still there was no answer, and stewards advancing towards me conducted me outside. You can really see how the suffragettes revelled in creating a sense of mystique about themselves, and one can only imagine the effect of this on Asquith, being firmly reminded that the question of women's suffrage did not wait for him in London when he went elsewhere. The WSPU kept up the pressure in Birmingham, as a few months later, in February 1909, Christabel Pankhurst returned to Town Hall to address an audience on the topic of women's suffrage. And according to this issue of Votes for Women newspaper, quote, received an ovation the like of which no woman has ever received in Birmingham, end quote. You can see the enthusiastic report in the right-hand column, allegedly. Quote, the town hall meeting was an even greater excess than we had anticipated, and the meeting was so successful that the WSPU took on 50 new members that week, end quote. The Birmingham Pictorial and Dance devoted an entire half-page column to the event, saying that, quote, local suffragettes have this week been made happy and content, for, complying with a long-standing promise, Miss Christabel Pankhurst visited Birmingham on Tuesday and addressed an audience that nearly filled the town hall. You'll have to accept my apologies that the text is so small on the screen, and accept on faith that a good 2/3 of the article is a narration of her appearance and manner, which is honestly too cringe-inducing to read aloud. Nonetheless, though the piece never actually engages with her argument in any way, it does pay her a genuine compliment at the end. Quote, courage, persistence, ingenuity, that this accomplished woman possesses